Let's see. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Seb, and I'm going to talk about the title that is here. It's going to be very much relevant to what I'm going to do in the PhD, but let's just keep that in mind that it's just going to be a theme of a study. It's not one particular study, but here we're going to talk about mostly eventually about one particular study. So with that in mind, this is the outline of what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of why I'm doing this kind of this approach to consciousness research. I don't think it's going to be enough philosophical material for a philosophical debate. So, for example, I'm not going to be arguing why I believe that illusionism is the best bet for consciousness, but I'm going to provide, for example, some reasons that why it's the best strategy to assume while doing a scientific research. And then I'm going to give a very short example of what a default theory of consciousness should look like, but then I cannot, again, get into the details of that theory because that requires another conversation that I think soon I will give a presentation on. And then after just having a very fun slide about the practical problems of researching things like attention and consciousness, and especially their relationship, I'm going to finally start to talk about the project that I have. Okay. So yeah. So when we think about consciousness, one of the first names, maybe after Descartes, that come to our mind is David Chalmers, and with his famous coining of the term hard problem of consciousness versus the easy problems. As many of you know, hard problems are, let's go with easy. Easy problems are, explaining how certain processes in the brain work, the memory, like attention, these kind of stuff, for which we know how to answer those questions. We have a paradigm, we know that there are experiments, there's neurons, and so on and so forth. But with the hard problem, there seems to be something different about the experience of consciousness that appears to be outside of the scientific experiment. No matter how much you want to talk about neurons and their interactions, there still seems to be no real reason why we shouldn't have all of that without the phenomenal experience of consciousness, which I'm going to define a bit later. But then recently, finally, we are coming to some sort of agreement that we can start our scientific journey with focusing on slightly different problems, and then see maybe we can answer the hard problem eventually, or maybe the hard problem turns out not to be a problem at all. And that is the birth of meta problem, which, if there is a philosophical joke that anything you can do, I can do meta. And it's just, if hard problem is a problem about why is it that there's mental experience from the matter, the meta problem is why is it that we think that's a problem? So in other terms, it's just why is it that it seems to us that there is a hard problem anyways, or how is it that a system like human brain can report that it has certain mysterious properties of its experience? That would be the meta hard problem. And so, of course, then we need to speak about the differentiation between phenomenal consciousness versus access consciousness, which I believe has been coined by Ned Block. And as you can see, he is giving a lecture about our thinking and feeling fundamentally different. So access consciousness would be when you have basically access to the information that some people claim consciousness would bring with itself. But the phenomenal consciousness would be the experience itself. In my experience, the best way to describe phenomenal consciousness is to repeat the word twice. So it would be the redness of the red, the warmness of the warm, something like that. When you look at the apple, it's not just some sort of signal of red. There's something it is like to be experiencing the state of red, right? So obviously this distinction is not accepted by everybody, and we might talk about it a little bit. But it brings us to the topic of qualia, which refers to these building blocks basically of the phenomenal experience, phenomenal consciousness, which they have the property of being intrinsic, they are private, they are ineffable, meaning that no matter how well You can, no matter how great you are at describing things, you cannot describe your phenomenal experience completely for another human being. And also they are directly available to the consciousness. And just to mention that I'm citing Dennett here, but he doesn't list these qualities to cuddle with them. He actually tries to dismantle them one by one in his paper called Coining Qualia. And basically what he argues is that we have no reason to believe any of these things are true, and they are basically our misunderstanding, a kind of folk notion of consciousness that we have. And he gave some sort of thought experiments to demonstrate his point, which is not accepted by everybody, of course. So now, I forgot to mention illusionism, but this is the best place to talk about illusionism. So when it comes to the hard problem of consciousness, you can have certain positions. You can believe qualia to be real things that play a causal role in the system. Then in that case, you could be a dualist, for example, or you don't have to be dualist necessarily. You could be, for example, a qualia realist, thinking that these are actual physical stuff, but we need, for example, quantum physics to describe them, or even not that. But the important part is for you to believe qualia are real stuff, or you can just reject them. You can, be like a eliminative materialist, saying that these are just false ideas coming from the folk notion. Or you could be illusionist, which is not so different from eliminative materialist, but I like to give it, not just me, give it another category, because in illusionism, they claim that everything you say is true, but it just seems like that. And just to make clear, nobody claims that there is no experience or there is nothing to be like. What they claim is that this whole thing is an illusion, which we cannot get into right now in very detail, but what I can do is that I can argue that why it is the best way to go in a scientific paradigm of consciousness. And it's simply because if you look at basically everything we know from psychology and subjective inflation, change blindness, anything, we would come to the understanding that we are terrible at judging our own experience. We, on a routinely basis, make mistakes, and then you kind of wonder that why should I take a first-person theory or first-person perspective on my own experience very seriously? If I'm wrong all the time about everything, maybe I should just withhold the judgment from inside and then start to just study things from the third-person perspective, which would be the objective and scientific perspective. Now, this doesn't mean to just throw everything, out of the window and just claim that there is no mental experience and inner experience. We're not talking about radical behaviorism, obviously, but this actually just builds a bit of ground to be skeptical of our own experience, and that is important because, given everything that we know from the scientific world, if we encounter a phenomenon that actually, at least prima facie, appears to be at direct opposite of what we already know of the physical reality, we shouldn't, if there is any reason to doubt that such phenomena is an illusion, we should take that. Because we know we have a wealth of basically reasons to think that this is true, not the addition. And introspection, because of all of the illusions that it is prone to, doesn't appear to be good reason to just throw everything we know from physical reality and to claim that, oh, okay, we just need to add something to the current knowledge that we have of the world. Now, this doesn't get rid of the problem of qualia completely, but it just assumes that let's proceed with the illusion and saying that our experience is very much is basically colored with different colors of illusion, cultural, cognitive, and after we took care of all of those, after we explain all of the easy problems, let's see if there is any hard problem after all. And that's why this is what I call agnostic illusionism. So it's not claiming that there is nothing after that. It's just simply agnostic about that part. And so the default theory of consciousness this is attention schema theory of consciousness. It is endorsed by a lot of illusionists for obvious reasons, and it starts to talk about, instead of taking, qualia or this, phenomenal consciousness to be a real state that we just jump into, it talks about why is it that we believe that we have some sort of mysterious experience about, our consciousness. And in some sense, you can call it a theory of meta problem. But what's important about this theory, but I don't want to talk about it too much, what's important about this theory is that it talks about how the brain models its own attention, and it talks about why it is evolutionary beneficial. It has to do with control. And why that model of the attention needs to be kind of sketchy, you don't need all the details. And for that matter, when you probe that model of attention, it seems that, first of all, it doesn't project back to any real physical property in the world, because even though attention is a physical, it's something real. I mean, I'm going to argue that it's not real, but just even though attention is a physical process, it's not out there, so you cannot project anything back to it. It's not like an apple. But because it's a messy, sketchy kind of model, it seems that it's kind of immaterial to the system itself. So this doesn't explain anything, but it's a good idea to be mindful that, consciousness may not be a thing. As Dennett always says, consciousness is not a trick, it's a bag of tricks. And this is for now, I guess this is enough for. And you don't have to believe that attention is a real thing. And as long as you believe that there are certain processes in the brain that, we can later call some of them attention, and we have a folk notion of attention. As long as you believe there's something that selects some signals in the brain, that's good enough, and that can be modeled. So the practical problem of researching attention and consciousness would be that in one paper, the Brigard and Prinz argue that there are different piles of experimental support for any of these claims. Attention is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. Consciousness is selective, attention is selective, and then you can have a model of, things are selected by the attention and then they're sent to the consciousness. Or attention is necessary but not sufficient for consciousness. Or attention is not necessary for, there is evidence for all of these things, and depending on how you want to define attention, how you want to define consciousness, things become more complicated. And the moral of this story is that no single scientific study is going to debunk any other studies, because in all of them there are critics of maybe this is the confound, and and they define it as, they basically defend each other's studies. So it's not so easy when you look at all the different camps. It really depends on how you want to define consciousness. And in fact, one should never be surprised to see anything like nowadays. And now we go to updating qualia, which is the topic of my dissertation. And I like this term, not going to get rid of this term, because it's not just that I'm trying to add some information to qualia, but also I'm going to try to argue that qualia is updating, like the Bayesian kind of updating. So there are processes rather than points. I'm slowly trying to introduce my experiment, but before that, the rationale is to just perceive qualia as some sort of updating processes rather than ignited time points. And I'm kind of swimming in the waters of predictive processing here, but still, I'm not going to talk about them here, because like attention schema theory, that is also a long conversation. But the moral of that worldview basically is that all you need for a functional system like human brain to survive in this, somehow unpredictable environment is that it needs to perform certain functions at different levels, and those functions basically will eventually capture the statistical characteristics of the environment, and by just inferring the lower level that you are getting signals from, and basically checking whether your top-down hypothesis is matched or mismatched, you can basically model everything. But I just made a very fast conclusion here, but yeah, that is the basic idea. So the brain is a hierarchical system, and we only pass up the prediction error, and then we basically explain everything. So there's of course objections to this, but there is merit to it as well. We know that there is perceptual inferences. We know that, for example, we are not a machine just to represent things and perform computation on it. We also embodied stuff. So there is merit to this idea. And the question that I'm asking is, what is the role of predictive cueing in conscious perception? So it's slightly different with the role of context in the conscious perception, in a sense that usually when you have context, well, context provides some, for example, context can have a gist, and then the gist could provide some information about the item that you're processing. But what if you kind of arbitrarily introduce some sort of associative learning here, and then instead of showing one thing, show like that thing, and then add the information afterwards to it? Is that going to be taken, as one kind of helpful perception? In other words, the second informative thing, which in and of itself doesn't have any, intrinsic information, is that going to kind of project back on how you experience the first thing? And so before talking about that, we need to talk about some famous neurocurrents of consciousness, and one of them, the famous one, happens to be visual awareness negativity. So we usually arrive at these, ERPs by basically subtracting different signals. So if you have a task that subject has to report whether they saw something or not, in all the tasks that subjects say, yeah, I saw it and there was a conscious experience of it, you call them the aware task. They will have their own electrical signature, and then the unaware condition, which would be subjects saying that no, I didn't see anything, they will have their own unique, let's say, signal. And then if you subtract them, you'll end up with some bumps and some markers, and then you can give them names, which is a dangerous thing to do, but we do. So it has been shown that excuse me, it has been shown that this sort of visual awareness negativity is actually present, and it is not, it is not some sort of confound like selection negativity or other possible attentional confounds, but we're not still so sure that it is something that we have never seen before. So there are some suspicions there yet, but it has been the most reliable NCC of visual awareness. Actually, there is this guy Forster with his colleagues. They do a review on everything that has been published in the last 10 years on attention and awareness about, concerning MEG or EEG. So it is their conclusion. And they conclude that this should probably respond to phenomenal awareness or phenomenal consciousness. Whereas if you talk about another marker of consciousness, which would be P300 or P3, that should respond to the reflective or access consciousness. Now, you might ask that there are many other hypotheses or other explanations that can explain P3 much better than conscious or conscious access, and you would be right. For example, context updating working memory is a far better explanation for P300, and to be honest, P300 is not a good NCC, and as for all we know, it might not even be an NCC. The reason that it has been around is that there's a theory called global neuronal workspace theory, which is a very famous one, and it predicts the P300 to be the marker of consciousness, and that's why we seem to obviously unable to get rid of this easily. But it has been shown many times that, as I will explain, when you control for certain things, VAN stays, but P300 disappears. So yeah, it brings us to the issue of report or no report. So obviously when I'm recording the patient, subject's brain, and there are some ERPs, if I ask them to report on their experience, what is going to happen is that, how do I know that the ERP I'm receiving is for the conscious experience itself, and not the decision making of pressing a button or just speech or something. And for that matter, some have argued that maybe it's better to use no report paradigms, and that is actually in Forster's paper. They talk about the fact that we should combine these things together because that also has its own confounds. And the criticism would be that when subjects are looking without reporting, they might mind wandering. You all know that. And some people argue that the no report would be not enough because you cannot control for, completely for attention, or you cannot control for the slight memories that it might bring with itself and this kind of stuff. Also, the no report would overestimate neural correlates of consciousness in some sense that it might include some preconscious activity. Then there's another camp which would say that no report can be too much, and I would consider myself as belonging to that camp. But what I'm saying is that after a certain point, you should be really asking, what is it that you want? So I'm okay with making sure that the button press ERP is not in your signal. But if you're looking for something that it's not memory, so let's peel like an onion. Let's get rid of memory. Let's get rid of decision making. Let's get rid of attention, working memory, language, and then it's going to be something that is like the pure experience of consciousness. And if I can just freeze the brain at that beautiful magical millisecond, I can just see what regions are involved in it. You might be actually ghost hunting, because as best as we can tell, nothing will remain if you get rid of all the cognitive processes. So that is why Dennett and Cohen in one paper 2011 argued that there is no consciousness without function. But anyways, it is a good strategy to do so. And LP, which would be late positivity, or the P300, disappears in many studies when they use no report paradigm. So it might have something to do with the report itself. Which brings us to the task relevance, and again, LP disappears in task relevance, but Van does not. And task relevance could also be another confound for neural correlates of consciousness, but again, I would be a little bit hesitant of where do I want to go with the task relevance, because take everyone's favorite examples of emotions. Let's say that you're in a jungle and there's a tiger, and then experience something, and then the tiger goes, and now you just go to talk to your friend that just received a promotion. It's a silly experiment, but just let's go with it. And now you're attending to the content of your friend's story, but there's still this physiological reactions that you had from the tiger. Is it the same kind of consciousness of that, emotion when you are, not paying attention to it as best as you can and trying to understand the person's talk? Is it the same compared to when you're like, oh my God, I just attacked by tiger, I'm afraid, and all this kind of certain thoughts? It appears to be a different kind of consciousness and different kind of state to be in, at least. And if you just make things control for task relevance too much, you might actually risk answering a different question, not the one that how conscious experience comes to be. And so this is one example of how if you ask subjects to look at the dim disk that is around here and basically try to count how many times they saw this dim disk, and then you record their brain basically. Then you can afterwards, after the block is over, you can ask them that, did you see the score patterns? And then half of them actually would say yes, half of them would say no. And then you compare the signals, and then you would see that there is no P300 here in the different signal. But then you tell them that it is going to be some squares in the middle, but please again count the stuff around. They're also going to do it again. This time every subject would notice that, would report that yes, they noticed the square patterns, but again you would see that there is no P300. But if you tell them that this time just look in the center, and try to look for the rare diamond pattern, or sorry, this is a square pattern, but there's a rare diamond pattern, then you would see that, oh, when the requirement, when the information is task relevant, and you are aware of it, you know that's something what to look for, then you would see the P300. So this is some inattentional strategy. Also with Meloni 2011, I'm going to take some time on this one, even though ironically I haven't read their paper completely. This is an interesting paper because in the past 10 years, this is the only EEG study on the effects of expectations on consciousness. So not just the properties of the bottom-up signal, but how you come to basically use your expectations. And what they did is that they had a ascending sequence and a descending sequence of stimuli, and then as you can see in the ascending, there is a very distorted image, and it becomes better and better, more clear, more visible when it reaches a level 6. This is level 1, this is level 6. And from the descending, well, it's the opposite. So you see the level 6, and then it becomes degraded, goes back to the level 1. And so while you're looking at that, they're basically recording your ERPs, and they're looking at the P2 component. P2 component is directly related to visual awareness negativity. So it's like, I mean, directly, like, it correlates positively, not that, meaning that if there's an effect in the P2, there should be an effect in the VAN as well. And what they saw is that, so this is the amplitude of a signal, and this is the L1 and to L6. What they saw is that when you're going from, in the ascending compared to the descending usually has a lower voltage, but only in cases that visibility is a little bit problematic. And that's why they argued that it might not be related to conscious experience per se, but maybe the issue of visibility. And last night when I was preparing this particular slide, I actually had an idea and wrote to Meloni about it. I don't know when she's going to respond, but my idea was that maybe not. Maybe actually what is happening here is that this particular region is responding to something that I call prediction conflict, and I didn't know of any better word to call for it. And my argument was that we shouldn't just take a look at the L2, we should just read them from different locations. So in the descending, let's say in the ascending, we start from level 1, we go to level 6. What happens is that at the level 1, there is nothing here, so I mean there is a little s, but it's not clear, so there is a range of possibilities that could be happening. So obviously the region might be trying to infer what is going on. Imagine if I told you that I'm thinking of something in Russia. It is a vast range of possibilities. But if I told you that I'm thinking about something in my room, now automatically a lot of options are eliminated. At least I cannot be talking about a building or a lake or something. So this is important. And then once it gets more clear, well, the conflict is getting less and less, because you're seeing that, oh, there's an S, so the alternatives are getting eliminated. And the reason that this is nonlinear is that because at some point you just realize that that's an S. We recognize S, and then we just find out this letter. Whereas in the descending sequence, you're starting from the level 6. So it is very clear that it's an S and it's getting degraded over time. Therefore, the conflict is getting more and more because it is becoming less visible. So on theory could be different things. However, there is a certain information that you have which you didn't have at the other situation, which is there is an S that is getting degraded. So that might kind of account for why this one is linear, relatively speaking. And if I'm correct, if my suspicion is correct, P2 actually kind of responds to prediction conflict, which is not even a real term, I just came up with it. So take-home notes is that late positivity is not a good NCC, and most certainly reflects post-perceptual processes. Actually, there are other papers that show that. So it's okay, every paper that checks it, almost every paper comes to the conclusion that LP is not a good NCC. Whereas Van appears to be a good candidate, and of course there are studies that didn't detect Van. They detect LP but not Van, but there's controversy around them, and most papers seem to be, this seems to be a consistent finding. However, we don't know how expectation changes Van. We know nothing about this because almost every study just, doesn't control for the expectation, but when the subject comes to the experiment, they're not, some, visual model. They have all their expectations about themselves, about the system. So if we don't control for the expectation, at the very least, we cannot be sure about the latency, or even the amplitude is not so important right now, but the latency of these ERPs, which would eventually bring us to the task that I have in mind. Now, I'm going to slowly talk about it. Basically, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to use certain stimuli, which I'm going to say how I make them. And then after these stimuli are shown, they're going to see a color cue, but this color cue is somehow related to the stimuli. And then after that, they have to report whether they saw a face, or we're going to talk about it. So the stimuli is, as you can see, it's a combination of face and house, right? So, but it's either very much face, or it's either very much house, or it's ambiguous. So it's like 50-50. However, one side note here is that right now we're doing the bottom-up fair, meaning that 50% of the face and 50% of the house, but it could be top-down fair. It could be, because we are kind of face sensitive, so maybe a 50-50 picture of face and house still looks like a face, and that is another experiment. I think it could be nice as well, but for now. And what is going to happen is that after a session of training, which I'm going to mention very soon, the subject has to basically report whether they saw a face or a house, and it would look like something like this. I'm kind of embarrassed to show this, but because this is not even ready. But so you see that there's a flash of the picture, and then there is a circle. And if you notice that there was just an empty circle, it wasn't meta-contrast masking. It is I think it's a bug in the program. I actually checked the video, and there's no meta-contrast there. There's nothing there. So procedure is going to be, it's going to have a lot of blocks, and what I'm going to do is that in the first 3 blocks, I just will tell participants to just watch. Just life is beautiful, enjoy your life. I need the baseline. I need their baseline of when they're looking at the critical trials, which would be those that are ambiguous. And there would be no relationship between the circle, the color circle, and the critical, any kind of trials. I just want to see their baseline brain reaction to the critical trial itself, without any relationship with anything. After that, I'm going to have them to basically watch and notice if there is any statistical relationship between the cues and stimuli. And here is when I introduce a statistical relationship, and it could go something like this. If what you saw was a face, then it's going to be a red circle, and if what you saw was a house, then it's going to be a green circle, or vice versa. It could be counterbalanced. What's important is that I don't need any critical trials here because I'm going to train subjects on that. So for 4 blocks, they're going to be seeing face followed by a red circle, and a house followed by a green circle. And of course, it doesn't have to be 100%. It could be like 80%. And after that, when we enter the testing stage, let's say, now we can do interesting stuff. And before I talk about them, all of these can be counterbalanced. So these two should come after each other, but there is no reason that, for example, report and task relevant couldn't be here. These needs to be, in fact, counterbalanced. So then I will have different conditions, like no report and task. I will tell them that at the end of each block, report how many times they saw a green circle or a red circle, so that the information about the face house is task irrelevant, and they're not reporting anything, they're just watching and counting. And the reason that I don't have them just watch here is just because I agree that mind wandering could happen, so I'm giving them some slight easy task. Cohen has done this as well in a recent paper. Again, in another block, I can ask them to, at the end of each trial, report whether they saw a green or red circle. And here they are reporting. Now they're reporting and they're reporting, and then, so this is a report condition, and it is the information about the face is still task irrelevant. So because they're focusing on what they saw as a green or red. And as you can see, the no report task relevance, which would be at the end of each block, just say how many times they saw a face and house. And this should be actually, it is very important to sometimes say face and sometimes say house to different participants, because if you ask them to attend more to the face, there might be more face detectors for the length of this block. And finally, report and task relevant, just report whether they saw a face or a house. What I don't tell them is that there are going to be some critical trials that what you see is not a face nor a house. It's a mix. They're not going to know that. So I'm going to do some comparisons, and pay attention that what I'm doing doesn't really have some sort of aware versus unaware. It has some ambiguous versus clear, maybe, or ambiguous and cued versus just ambiguous. So I would do critical versus baseline. I would do critical face versus critical house. What I mean by this is that if you see a critical image and then you report it to be the face, I will take it as critical face. And I will do the same thing with the house. And I want to see for each condition how the signal is different for the critical points that you reported to be the face versus the house. And also I want to see how the critical face reports differs with the actual face, and vice versa. This is, I think, the most important part here. The critical versus the baseline. And so some more electrophysiological hypotheses, even though honestly we cannot make much, is going to be LP's late positivity's amplitude will be a function of task relevance and report. So I expect the amplitude to be just maximum when the information is task relevant and in the report condition, and then to drop in other conditions. And also, if visual awareness negativity truly reflects phenomenal consciousness, then in the visual system, of course, then we should also see it in our critical versus baseline, because what's happening in baseline is that you're seeing something that is not very clear, that is a face or a house, whereas in the cued condition, when you've been trained to associate these two together, you would report that you have experienced a face. So it's not that you would be like, oh, I didn't experience any face, but because it was red, I would just report to you that it was a face. I expect the experience to actually just flow naturally for most of the cases, not just for everyone. The reason is that they are very close in the time window, and there's no reason why we should be, when we don't know that such a thing is going to happen, we would be able to detect them. Of course, we will see the effects in the results. So if that is not the case, then I need to come up with a different idea. But I don't think that's going to happen, because I've already tested that on myself as well. So on the other hand, if visual awareness negativity doesn't differentiate before conditions, then it might truly be related to visibility rather than awareness. So basically you would be like, what does the critical condition has in common with the baseline? Well, they are equally visible, and there is nothing clear about them. So if Van cannot differentiate between them, it would mean that there's nothing about consciousness per se, but that's just visibility. And of course I have a prediction about the amplitude of the P2 based on the story I gave on Meloni's paper, but honestly, I don't want to embrace it too much because it is very difficult to come up with a hypothesis when we're doing something very new and like the cue would be after the stimulus and stuff. The most important part is that phenomenal access distinction doesn't make sense. I mean, if you think about it, if you take the idea of phenomenal access distinction too seriously, it would be that you would have a phenomenal consciousness without having access to it. There are theories that actually predict that. For example, recurrent processing theory would talk about the fact that phenomenal consciousness is a recurrent process in the brain, and sometimes you may not have access to it. So it would kind of be like there is something that it is like to be you in that state, but you don't have access to that state, so you're not there. And it's kind of strange. And of course you could say that, well, I mean, you can have, always access consciousness should be accompanied by phenomenal consciousness, but not vice versa. But I don't really understand this distinction. It is just, it seems to be not supported by any kind of evidence as overground reviews. And also, as I said, given that we don't have enough predictive processing friendly studies, who knows, visual awareness negativity may turn out to be yet another mistaken neurocorrelative consciousness. Or maybe we would see other NCCs or with other latencies at least. So future plans would involve, future plans would involve, performing my double dissociation between the task-relevance and reports on Meloni's task, or even maybe, comparing, like adding my own face house element to it that, imagine if a picture becomes more of a face and less of a house, or vice versa. I can also, in another study, I can use some sort of perceptual awareness scale, meaning that asking participants to say, to rate from 1 to 4 how vivid their experience was. 1 would be I saw nothing, I experienced nothing. 4 would be like very much experience, clear experience, and in between would be in between. And I even can do this in the current one. So instead of just telling subjects to report whether they saw a face or a house, I can ask them to, whatever you saw, how clear that experience was. And then I can look at, I can use some sort of pilot experiment to show that actually the subject's response is going to be biased according to the cue. And then I can use that to say that, okay, so cue actually made it more, added more confidence in the response, and we can kind of argue that then it had something to do with their frontal experience. And if that is true, it would mean that an unrelated cue, which is a color, could basically shape your subjective awareness of a previous stimulus that would be an ambiguous face or house. That's something that I need to discuss with my supervisor. Bottom-up fair versus the top-down fair, I explained that, and we could use colors instead of face and house, but that would be a more problematic story in my opinion. They could do the cross-modal, and this post-cue, this circle, colorful circle, could actually be a sound. And the benefit of this would be that I can bring it much closer to the stimulus and do not risk metacontrast masking. But that's, again, this is future plans. Or, I can go to Mars and ask about the knowledge of consciousness that all of these Martian scientists that philosophers happen to obsess about have. Or finally, I can do some MEG study on face and house. And this is nice if I can pull it off, because we can do some sort of content determination. And then we can see based on the signal whether the subject was, experiencing kind of face and how much of a face were they experiencing. This is going to be very difficult, and I cannot run a multivariate pattern analysis, but not to mention the MEG part. But this is also something to just have in mind. And right now I believe I'm ready to talk about everything, comments, questions, and thank you for listening.